Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Locomotives for Blackstone. Thank you to those who left comments on my previous video. All these comments really are helping me to adapt my filmography and the way that I record things. It really is helpful. Thank you. This week's episode is going to be focusing on the London, Brighton and South Coast Railways goods locomotives, primarily the six-wheeled tender locomotives. Mercifully, there are only 3 locomotives featuring this week: the C2, the C2X and the C3, which will tender the central goods section goods for Blackstone. Once again, my data will primarily be sourced from the Russell volume, which was outlined in the previous episode, and I left a link to the book retail on Amazon in the description of the previous video as well. Beginning with the C2, this series of locomotives was designed by the elder Billington, being constructed at Vulcan Foundry between 1893 and 1902, eventually numbering 55 examples. And these were the development of the older Stroudly designed C1, only one of which survived a grouping in 1923. Despite being fitted with a higher pressure boiler, the C2s were not quite as powerful as their predecessors, but they were found to be good runners at high speeds, which was useful as the intensity of traffic on the Brighton network increased. By the first decade of the 20th century, though, they were beginning to fall behind in their timings and often could not manage the loads allocated to them without assistance or easings of time, and began to be dispersed around the network. Number 439 was allocated to St Leonard's Shed by 1923, presumably running regular and pickup goods along the coastline and bringing in coal for the depot. My investigations into kits for this particular class have turned up nothing specifically for the C2. However, I imagine the DJH kit could easily be backdated with a 3D printed boiler to the C2 pattern. It appears that everything below the footplate is identical between the two classes, with only the cab and the boiler differing. Onto the C2X, this would be a straightforward build of the DJH kit, with adaptations to the well-known issues with the body height to bring it down to size. The C2X was a reboilered C2 in its most simplistic form, being paired with a C3 boiler designed by Marsh, with an extended smoke box, new cylinders and a new cab. Other non-visible changes to the locomotives included an increase in the tender's water capacity, obviously increasing its range and usefulness. This process began in 1908, 2 years after the introduction of the final locomotive in this episode, the successful C3, which had proven its mettle in those 2 years. The boiler, at any rate. 45 C2s were rebuilt into the C2X over the course of 32 years. And I'm afraid I have not yet found a locomotive that quite works with the C2X to allocate to Blackstone, but when I find one I will update my workbench thread on ORMweb with the details. Finally, we're moving on to the C3. As I've mentioned, this locomotive was designed by Marsh and was built at Brighton Works in 1906, with this class being intended for the heaviest freight trips around the company's metals. But the class proved to be disappointing, with a rather high fuel consumption, and it was a tad underpowered in comparison to its predecessors. The class thereafter were relegated to secondary goods workings throughout Sussex, and the boiler was used in the rebuilding of Brighton locomotives of all varieties for the remainder of that company's existence and throughout Southern days, notably being used on Maunsell Z class of 1929. Due to the shortcomings of the C3, it never expanded beyond the original 10 locomotives of 1906. Again, there are no known kits for the C3, and ultimately this might work quite well as a 3D kit in time. It certainly seems to have worked well for other Brighton locomotives. The locomotive I have settled on for Blackstone is also a St Leonard's example, number 301, covering much the same duties as the other two goods locomotives. These are perhaps back burner locomotives, ones which I will focus on less than the southeastern examples by virtue of their difficulty and the stronger southeastern influence on Blackstone overall. I hope you found this video informative. I'm certainly finding it useful to record my research in a video format as well as written online. Next week, with any luck, if you're not bored yet, we'll be looking at the South Eastern and Chatham's prolific 440 passenger series with a history spanning 30 years. I'm Alex and you've been watching AVS Railways.